Now, in closing, I would just like to mention, talk about the history of the United States and the right of self-determination of oppressed peoples. Now, two recent political acts that have gained widespread publicity in the corporate media were the proclamation of Southern Heritage Month in the state of Virginia by Governor Robert McDonnell in April of 2010, and the subsequent opinion piece by Professor Henry Louis Gates of Harvard, who questioned the legitimacy of the demand for reparations among African Americans in the United States. McDonnell issued this proclamation saying that this should be Southern Heritage Month without even mentioning slavery. Then he went back and changed it a few days later, but the damage had already been done. How can you talk about the Confederacy without talking about slavery? But this is the revisionist history that's being pushed right now in the United States. In previous articles that's been published in Workers' World, one entitled Confederate Heritage and the Distortion of History, and another one entitled The Atlantic Slave Trade and the Rise of World Capitalism, these articles, and I don't have time to go into this now, examine issues related to the responsibility for and the continuing social impact of slavery, because we still today are suffering from the legacy of slavery right here in the United States. These ideological attacks on the right to full democracy and self-determination for African American people and other oppressed national groups in the United States are coming at a time of profound economic restructuring and imperialist military expansion around the world. The apartheid laws enacted in Arizona that legalize racial profiling and outlaws ethnic studies even. So even speaking like this at a university in Arizona right now, I guess would be considered against the law. Yeah. So hey, they're going to drive it underground again. You know, we had to wage a protracted struggle just to get black studies and Latino studies and women's studies and LGBT studies on the campuses during the 60s and 70s. So now they're taking back, you know, these gains that were won from the system some 40 years ago. These actions must be viewed within the context of the rapidly shifting demographic composition of the U.S. and the need on the part of the capitalist class to maximize profits amid economic decline. The demographics of this country is shifting. The majority of babies that are going to be born in the United States in 2010 are babies of color. By the middle of the 21st century, it's estimated that the majority will be the so-called people of color in the United States. So they feel very threatened, the ruling class in this country. The Tea Party movement represents such an ideological offensive aimed at dividing and weakening the struggle of the nationally oppressed and the working class as a whole in this country. Yet the mass outpouring on May Day of over 1 million people who said no to anti-immigrant bigotry and yes to jobs and full employment and legalization for all far outweighs the efforts of racist and chauvinist elements backed by the capitalist class. The burgeoning unity of African Americans, Latinos, Arab Americans, Asians, and other oppressed groups will be a key element in building the people's movement that is needed to abolish capitalism and imperialism in this period. Major historical events of the 19th century, the large-scale removal of the native people from their land, the Mexican-American War, and the Civil War that abolished slavery still remain unresolved today as we speak. The native people of Arizona have spoken out forcefully against the apartheid laws now being imposed that target the Mexican people whose land was stolen at the same time that Africans were being enslaved inside the United States. In 2010, the current economic crisis has most profoundly affected the African American and the Latino people. A recent study conducted by the Center for Responsible Lending indicates that Latinos and African Americans have the highest foreclosure rates in the United States. Both groups also have the highest unemployment rates in the U.S. labor market. Compounding these economic realities, African Americans and Latinos are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system with incarceration rates that far outstrip their numbers within the general population. Over half the prison population in this country are people of color, African Americans and Latinos, and all the rest are working class people. Won't hardly find any rich people in prison. No. And no rich people that I know are on death row. Not even one of them. Now, these rates of imprisonment are directly linked to racial profiling by law enforcement and Homeland Security. which the passage of SB 2070 in Arizona only reinforces this process. This is why efforts to pass such legislation in Michigan should be opposed by African Americans, Latinos, and all people of goodwill. The struggle for genuine democracy and the right to self-determination for oppressed nations are principal questions within the socialist movement. V.I. Lenin, the leader and chief theoretician of the Russian Revolution, wrote in his thesis on the socialist revolution and the right of nations to self-determination in early 1916 during World War I. Although the Bolshevik Party would not seize power until the following year in 1917, Lenin was adamant that both the struggle for full democracy and self-determination for oppressed nations were equally indispensable in the program of the Revolutionary Vanguard Party. Lenin says that, quote, "The socialist revolution is not a single act. It is not one battle on one front, but a whole epoch of acute class conflicts, a long series of battles on all fronts, i.e., on all questions of economics and politics, battles that can only end in the expropriation of the bourgeoisie. It would be a radical mistake to think that the struggle for democracy was capable of diverting the proletariat from the socialist revolution, or of hiding, overshadowing it, etc. On the contrary, in the same way as there can be no victorious socialism that does not practice full democracy, so the proletariat cannot prepare for its victory over the bourgeoisie without an all-around consistent and revolutionary struggle for democracy," unquote. Lenin then goes on to state as well that, quote, "It would be no less a mistake to remove one of the points of the democratic program. For example, the point on the self-determination of nations on the grounds of it being, quote, impractical, unquote, or, quote, illusory, unquote, under imperialism." Lenin goes on to say, and I close, "Increased national oppression under imperialism does not mean that social democracy should reject what the bourgeoisie calls the utopian struggle for the freedom of nations to succeed, but on the contrary, it should make greater use of the conflicts that arise in this sphere, too, as grounds for mass action and for revolutionary attacks on the bourgeoisie," unquote. Thank you very much.